Welcome to Preeminent Test Prep. Today I'll be taking you through the reading section of SAT Practice Test 10. I'll be giving you answer explanations as I walk through the passage, as well as any tips and tricks that I see are applicable to this passage. Make sure to subscribe for more content, and let's go ahead and get started with Passage 1. Alright, Passage 1 is adapted from Mary Helen Stefaniak, The Caliphs of Baghdad, Georgia, a novel 2010 by Mary Helen Stefaniak. So if you've already read the passage, you can go ahead and skip to the answer explanations that I give in about 5 minutes after I read through this passage aloud. But I'm going to go ahead and read this passage aloud for anyone who has not read the passage yet. So Miss Grace Spivey arrived in Three-Step, Georgia in August 1938. She stepped off the train wearing a pair of thick-soled boots suitable for hiking, a navy blue dress, a little white tam that rode the waves of her red hair at a gravity-defying angle. August was a hellish month to step off the train in Georgia, although it was nothing, she said, compared to the 119 degrees that greeted her when she arrived one time in Timbuktu, which she assured us was a real place in Africa. I believe her remark irritated some of the people gathered to welcome her on the burned grass alongside the tracks. When folks are sweating through their shorts, they don't like to hear that this is nothing compared to someplace else. Irritated or not, the majority of those present were inclined to see the arrival of the new school teacher in a positive light. Hard times were still upon us in 1938, but like my mama said, we weren't no poorer than we'd ever been, and the citizens of Three-Step were in the mood for a little excitement. Miss Spivey looked like just the right person to give it to them. She was, by almost anyone's standards, a woman of the world. She'd gone to boarding school since she was 6 years old. She'd studied French in Paris and drama in London. And during what she called a fruitful intermission in her formal education, she had traveled extensively in the Near East and Africa with a friend of her grandmother's, one Jeanette Miller, who was a medical doctor from Nashville, Tennessee. After her travels with Dr. Miller, Miss Spivey continued her education by attending Barnard College in New York City. She told us all that at school the first day. When my little brother Ralford asked what did she study at Barnard College, Miss Spivey explained that Barnard, which she wrote on the blackboard, was the sister school of Columbia University, of which she expected we had all heard. It was there, she told us, in the midst of trying to find her true mission in life, that she wandered one afternoon into a lecture by the famous John Dewey, who was talking about his famous book, Democracy and Education. Professor Dewey was in his 70s by then, Miss Spivey said, but he still liked to chat with students after a lecture, especially female students, she added, sometimes over coffee, and see in their eyes the fire his words could kindle. It was after his lecture and subsequent coffee that Miss Spivey had marched to the Teachers' College and signed up all aflame. 2 years later, she told a cheery blue-suited woman from the WPA that she wanted to bring democracy and education to the poorest, darkest, most remote, and forgotten corner of America. They sent her to Three-Step, Georgia. Miss Spivey paused there for questions, avoiding my brother Ralford's eye. What we really wanted to know about, all 26 of us across 7 grade levels in the one room, was the pearly white button hanging on a string in front of the blackboard behind the teacher's desk up front. That button on a string was something new. When Mavis Davis, the only bona fide 7th grader at age 13, asked what it was for, Miss Spivey gave the string a tug, and to our astonishment, the whole world, or at least a wrinkled map of it, unfolded before our eyes. Her predecessor, Miss Chandler, had never once made use of that map, which was older than our father's, and until that moment, not a one of us knew it was there. Miss Spivey showed us on the map how she and Dr. Jeanette Miller had sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and past the rock of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean Sea. Using the end of her ruler, she gently tapped such places as Morocco and Tunis and Algiers to mark their route along the top of Africa. They spent 20 hours on the train to Baghdad, she said, swathed in veils against the sand that crept in every crack and crevice. And can you guess what we saw from the train, Miss Spivey said. We could not. Camels, she said. We saw a whole caravan of camels. She looked around the room, waiting for us to be amazed and delighted at the thought. We all hung there for a minute, thinking hard, until Mavis Davis spoke up. She means like the 3 kings rode to Bethlehem, Mavis said, and she folded her hands smugly on her 7th grade desk in the back of the room. Miss Spivey made a mistake right then. Instead of beaming upon Mavis, the kind of congratulatory smile that old Miss Chandler would have bestowed on her for having enlightened the rest of us, Miss Spivey simply said, "That's right." All right, now we're on to question 1. The narrator of the passage can best be described as, well, the answer is going to be A, right? It's one of Miss Spivey's former students. And the reason that it's one of Miss Spivey's former students is because if we go back up in the passage, it says she spoke to us, right? Well, if she's speaking to us, then the narrator has to be one of her former students because she was speaking in the classroom. All right, question 2. In the passage, Three-Step is mainly presented as a small rural town, right? And how do we know that? Well, we know it's a small rural town because it talks about how It's in pretty much the middle of nowhere in Georgia, right? It's hot, and it says that they had 7 grade levels, but only 26 people across those 7 grade levels. So we know it's going to be a small rural town in Georgia. All right, it can reasonably be inferred from the passage that some of the people at the train station regard Miss Spivey's comment about the Georgia heat with, well, that's going to be D, resentment, because they feel that she is minimizing this discomfort, right? And I'll show you why as we go into 4, which asks for evidence to answer the previous question. Well, how do we know that it's resentment? Because they feel that she is minimizing their discomfort? Well, because if we go up and we look at where this takes place, we see from sentence 10 to 14, it says, I believe her remark, right? Her remark that it was nothing, the heat was nothing, she said, compared to the 119 degrees that greeted her when she arrived in Timbuktu. It says, I believe her remark irritated some of the people gathered to welcome her on the burned grass alongside the tracks. When folks are sweating through their shorts, they don't like to hear that this is nothing compared to someplace else, right? So that's showing her remark, it irritated some people, right, which could cause feelings of resentment, right, because they feel she's minimizing their discomfort by talking about how hot it was in Timbuktu. So our evidence there is going to be B. All right, question 5. Miss Spivey most likely uses the phrase fruitful intermission to indicate that. Well, that's going to be to indicate that she benefited from taking time off of her studies in order to travel, right? If we look at our other choices, we have B, her travels with Janet Miller encouraged her to start medical school. That's wrong because it never says she wanted to start medical school. And then C, her early years at boarding school resulted in unanticipated rewards. That's not what it's talking about. And I'll go ahead and go back and show you where it is. So it's line 26, talking about the fruitful intermission in her education. So we see it says she'd gone to boarding school since she was 6 years old. She'd studied French in Paris and drama in London, and during what she called a fruitful intermission in her formal education, she had traveled extensively in the Near East and Africa with a friend of her grandmother's, one Jeanette Miller, who was a medical doctor from Nashville, Tennessee. Well, the fruitful intermission it's talking about is her extensive travel in the Near East and Africa, right? So that will tell us immediately then that we're talking about how she benefited from her travel, right? Fruitful, indicating she benefited from her break in education and in order to travel. So our answer there is going to be A. All right. And we see D is wrong because it says what she thought would be a short break from school lasted several years. It never says that, right? It never says she thought it'd be a short break. All right, and then question 6, the interaction between Miss Spivey and Ralford serves mainly to A, suggest that Miss Spivey has an exaggerated view of what information should be considered common knowledge. Yes, because if we go back to the exchange between Miss Spivey and Ralford, go ahead and find that. It's where they are talking about what she was studying at Barnard College, and she says that it was a sister school of Columbia, of which she expected we had all heard, right? So we see Ralford asks her what she studies, and it shows that she has a not accurate view of what people know, because she assumes they all heard of Columbia University, but they had not, right? All right, so we go ahead and move down. Question 6, right, suggested she had an exaggerated view of what information should be considered common knowledge, right? All right, and then we know B is wrong because it says establish a friendly dynamic between the charming school children and their indulgent and doting new instructor. No, because that friendly dynamic, right, we don't really know. And also we see later on that she refuses to look at Ralford, right, when he raises, or not when he raises his hand, but when she's looking for questions. And then C, introduce Ralford as a precocious young student and Miss Spivey as a dismissive and disinterested teacher. Well, she's not dismissive and disinterested, so C is wrong. And then D, demonstrate that the children want to amuse her with their questions. Well, they aren't really asking any questions, right? There was just one. There wasn't a series of them, so that's wrong as well. In the third paragraph, what is the narrator most likely suggesting by describing Miss Spivey as having wandered, line 40, in one situation and marched, line 49, into another situation? All right, well, we go to line 40 and 49, right? We want to utilize the text that we're given. It says she wandered one afternoon into a lecture by John Dewey, right? Well, that means she didn't really have a purpose, right? It was just kind of accidental, incidental, right? She was just kind of there and it happened, right? But then we see in 49, marched is used, right? She marched to the teacher's college and signed up all aflame, all ready to teach and all inspired, right? So that's going to be our contrast there. So we're going to go down, look at our answer choices. We see what's the narrator most likely suggesting by describing it in this light. Well, we have A, Dewey, knowing Miss Spivey wasn't very confident in her ability to teach, instilled in her a sense of determination. No, because she didn't even know she wanted to teach at first, right? And then B, talking with Dewey over coffee made her realize how excited she was to teach in the poorest, remote corner of Africa. Well, that doesn't really utilize anything with our word choice, right? Marched and wandered is more about how this went down, right? See, after 2 years spent studying, Miss Spivey was anxious to start teaching and be in charge of her own classroom. Well, remember, this was kind of an incident or an accident that she started teaching, right? It wasn't really that she set out going to Barnard to do this. And then D, Miss Spivey's initial encounter with Dewey's ideas was somewhat accidental, yes, but ultimately motivated her to decisive action, yes. That'll be our answer. All right, question 8. According to the passage, Miss Spivey ended up in 3-step as a direct result of talking with a woman at the WPA because she asked them, Miss Spivey asked them, where's like the place that needs me most, and the WPA sent her to 3-step. All right, question 9. In the passage, when Miss Spivey announces that she had seen camels, the students' reaction suggests that they are baffled, right? They don't know. They're not really sure what to think. So if we go back up and we look at that, and then we also need to find evidence, right? So we'll go ahead and find what line of evidence we're going to use for that anyways. But we go back to that exchange around camels, right? We see that when she says, and can you guess what we saw from the train? It says we could not, right? Students could not. Camels, she said. We saw a whole caravan of camels. She looked around the room waiting for us to be amazed and delighted at the thought, right? They weren't, but she thought they would be. We all hung there for a minute thinking hard, right? Trying to think of what these camels could be until Ms. Mavis Davis spoke up, right? So only one person in the classroom knew what she was talking about, so they were baffled, right? They weren't fascinated, weren't delighted, or worried. And we see that our answer for our evidence then is going to be B, we all to up in 85 to 86, right? We all hung there for a minute thinking hard because they didn't know what it was. All right. Now we've got passage 2, questions 11 to 21. This passage is adopted from David Owen, The Conundrum, How Scientific Innovation, Increased Efficiency, and Good Intentions Can Make Our Energy and Climate Problems Worse. And it was written in 2011 by David Owen. All right, building good transit isn't a bad idea, but it can actually backfire if the new trains and buses merely clear space on highway lanes for those who would prefer to drive, a group that historically has included almost everyone with access to a car. To have environmental value, new transit has to replace and eliminate driving on a scale sufficient to cut energy consumption overall. That means that a new transit system has to be backed up by something that impels complementary reductions in car use, say the physical elimination of traffic lanes or the conversion of existing roadways into bike or bus lanes, ideally in combination with higher fuel taxes, parking fees, and tolls. Needless to say, those ideas are not popular, but they're necessary because you can't make people drive less in the long run by taking steps that make driving more pleasant, economical, and productive. One of the few forces with a proven ability to slow the growth of suburban sprawl has been the ultimately finite tolerance of commuters for long, annoying commutes. That tolerance has grown in the recent decades, and not just in the United States, but it isn't unlimited. And even people who don't seem to mind spending half their day in a car eventually reach a point where finally enough is enough. That means that traffic congestion can have environmental value since it lengthens commuting times and by doing so discourages the proliferation of still more energy-hungry subdivisions. Unless we made the congestion go away, if in a misguided effort to do something of environmental value, municipalities take steps that make long-distance car commuting faster or more convenient by adding lanes, building bypasses, employing traffic control measures that make it possible for existing roads to accommodate more cars with fewer delays, replacing toll booths with radio-based systems that don't require drivers to even slow down, we actually make the sprawl problem worse by indirectly encouraging people to still live farther from their jobs, stores, schools, and doctors' offices, and by forcing municipalities to further extend road networks, power grids, water lines, and other civic infrastructure. If you cut commuting time by 10%, people who now drive 50 miles each way to work can justify moving 5 miles farther out because their travel time won't change. This is how metropolitan areas metastasize. It's the history of suburban expansion. Traffic congestion isn't an environmental problem. Traffic is. Relieving congestion without doing anything to reduce the total volume of cars can only make the real problem worse. Highway engineers have known for a long time that building new car lanes reduces congestion only temporarily, because the new lanes foster additional driving, a phenomenon called induced traffic. Widening roads makes traffic move faster in the short term, but the improved conditions eventually attract additional drivers and entice current drivers to drive more. And congestion reappears, but with more cars, and that gets people thinking about widening roads once again. Moving drivers out of cars and into other forms of transportation can have the same effect. If existing traffic lanes are kept in service, road space begets road use. One of the arguments that cities inevitably make in promoting transit plans is that the new system, by relieving automobile congestion, will improve the lives of those who continue to drive. No one ever promotes a transit system or a transit scheme by arguing that it would make traveling less convenient. even though from an environmental perspective, inconvenient travel is a worthy goal. All right, and then we're given a table, and now we can go and get into question 11. All right, the main purpose of the passage. A, to provide support for the claim that efforts to reduce traffic actually increase traffic. Well, that's not the main idea. The main idea we're talking about how the negative environmental, right? We're talking about negative environmental consequences associated with the increase in agreeability of driving less, right? As people can drive, as driving gets easier, there are negative environmental consequences as the roads fill up more, even if we expand the traffic lanes, right? It just causes more to come in, right? And then B, we have disputing the widely held belief that building and improving mass transit is good for the environment. Well, that's not the main purpose, right? And then we see C, discuss the negative environmental consequences of car-focused development and suburban sprawl. Well, we're not really discussing all the negative environmental consequences. More we're discussing the policy, right? So we're discussing the policy more than the negative environmental consequences. And then D, argue. Yes, we are definitely making an argument here that one way to reduce the negative environmental effects of traffic is to make driving less agreeable. Yes, right? The whole point of the passage is if we can increase the traffic congestion, people will be likely to drive less, right? Which will induce a positive change for the environment. So our answer there is going to be D. Question 12, which choice best supports the idea that the author assumes that all things being equal, people would rather drive than take mass transit? Well, that happens in the first paragraph. If we go up to the first paragraph, we see he says, building good transit isn't a bad idea, but it can actually backfire if the new trains and buses merely clear spaces on highway lanes for those who would prefer to drive, right? Those who prefer to drive, a group that historically has included almost everyone with access to a car, right? So almost everyone with a car prefers to drive, right? So if you look at that, we're going to look for evidence in line 5. All right, so we'll find which one is about 1 to 5 for our evidence. We see we have that in the answer choice A. So answer choice A there will be our answer. All right, question 13. As used in line 9, backed up most nearly means. Well, we'll go ahead and find it. Use our text to help us out. Question 9, line 9. That means that a new transit system has to be backed up by something that impels complementary reductions in car use, right? Well, in this case, backed up would mean supported, right? This means a new transit system has to be supported by something that impels complementary reductions in car use. All right, so we go back down, we see we have supported is A. All right, so we can get rid of our other answers. Question 14, in the first paragraph, the author concedes that his recommendations are what? All right, well, let's go ahead and find in the first paragraph. He concedes that his recommendations, well, let's go ahead and find. He says that we've got, needless to say, those ideas, right, all his recommendations are not popular. All right, so he's conceding that his recommendations, everything he's advocating is not popular because it's going to increase the traffic congestion. So go ahead and find where we have that. He's conceding that it is not popular, right? Not that it's strongly opposed by experts, but that his recommendations aren't popular, they're not widely supported by people. So our answer there is B. Question 15, based on the passage, how would the author most likely characterize many attempts to improve traffic? Well, he says the attempts to improve traffic, right, are negatively affecting the environment and therefore are harmful. So we have A, they are doomed to fail because most people like driving too much to change their habits. No, that's not what we're talking about. B, they overestimate how tolerant people are of long commutes. No. C, they are well-intentioned, right? He says they're well-intentioned. They want people to have less of a commute time, but they ultimately lead to environmental harm. So that's going to be our answer there. All right, 16, which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? All right, so we've got 8 to 14, 22 to 26, 31 to 40. Well, just thinking back to when I was reading through the passage, I know that where I talked about the policies that were being implemented, right, the policies at improving traffic, that was mainly in the middle, right? So I'm going to start there. So I'm going to start with these two. So I'll go ahead and take a look at 22 to 26 first. All right, I go back. When I do that, I see I have that tolerance has grown in the recent decades, and not just the United States, but it isn't limited. And even though people who don't seem to spend mining half their day in a car eventually reach a point where finally enough is enough, right? That isn't talking about municipalities that want to. It's not talking about municipalities' attempts to improve traffic there. So we can get rid of that one. 8 to 14 was more of an introduction. I'm going to look at 31 to 34, 31 to 40 next. So I'm going to go find that. We got 31 to 40. If in a misguided effort to do something of environmental value, municipalities take steps that make long-distance car commuting faster and more convenient, right? That's what we're talking about. Making traffic congestion decrease. If municipalities do that by adding lanes, building bypasses, employing traffic control, measures that make it possible for existing roadways to accommodate more cars with fewer delays, replacing toll booths with radio-based systems that don't require drivers to even slow down, we actually make the sprawl problem worse, right? We make the sprawl problem worse, which harms the environment. So that is going to be our evidence there, 31 to 40. So our answer is C. All right, question 17. According to the passage, reducing commuting time for drivers can have which of the following effects? Well, if we lower their commute time, they can move farther away from their workplaces, right? They can move away from their workplaces even farther. A, drivers become more productive employees. We never talk about that. B, mass transit gets extended farther into suburban areas than it previously was. Well, mass transit, right? That's more so referring to the trains and all of that, and that's not really what we're discussing here. We're discussing more cars. C, mass transit carries fewer passengers and receives less government funding. We don't discuss that. And then D, drivers become more willing to live farther from their places of employment than they previously were. Yes. As used in line 72, promotes most nearly means. Well, we go to 72. We see we have promotes is right here. So we'll read that sentence. No one ever promotes a transit scheme by arguing that it would make traveling less convenient. Well, when we say no one ever promotes a transit scheme by arguing, right, we're talking about advocating, right? So no one ever advocates a transit scheme by arguing that it would make traveling less convenient. So we go down, find our answer right here. It's going to be C, advocates, right? And what I recommend if you're asked to find what a word most nearly means is don't read your answer choices first. Come up with your own answer from reading the passage and then come in with that answer in mind and see if it's there first and foremost. Question 19, according to figure 1, how many vehicles traveled on the altered road through the Southampton city center per day before the route was altered? All right, so we're going to go to figure 1. We've got the Southampton city center right here. So we're concerned with this row going over. We're told the vehicles per day on the altered road. So we're considering, right, potentially these columns. Now we move on and it says before alteration. That's what we're considering. We're considering before the road was altered. So this, where this column meets this row, we see that that is here at 5316. So that's going to be our answer, 5,316. That'll be answer choice B. All right, question 20. Do the data in figure 1 support or weaken the argument of the author of the passage, and why? Well, let's go to the data in figure 1, interpret it, and then we'll come back with our answer. That way we're not swayed by the answer choices. All right, so we were told in figure 1. All right, what I see here is after we alter this road, and our title here is effect of route capacity reduction. So we're reducing the route capacity, which means we're increasing traffic congestion. So if we increase traffic congestion, then after our alteration, we see in every case, we have a decrease in vehicles per day on that road, right? So we have a decrease in the volume of vehicles, which means that we have a decrease in our carbon emissions, right, our environmental damage. And we see that the vehicles per day on the surrounding roads, they also tend to go down, right? We've got outliers here and here. Those ones went up, right, because these roads were altered. But we also see these ones go down, down, and then this one also goes up, right? But we see we have a change in traffic, right, which is our change in regional traffic in proportion to traffic previously using the alter road. We see our change in regional traffic net is going to go down, right? Our change in regional traffic is all negative, which means it went down, which proves the author's point. All right, it proves his point that by increasing traffic congestion, we can improve the environment. So it supports it. We can get rid of our weaken. We see we have support because the data shows that merely moving drivers out of cars can induce traffic. No, but B, support because the data shows that reducing road capacity, which is what it did, can lead to a net reduction in traffic. Yes, that was symbolized by those negative percents. Based on figure 2, the engineers surveyed were most skeptical of the idea that in the event of a reallocation of road space, drivers would change what? All right, well, in a reallocation of road space, we see that on right here we have, could a significant road space reallocation result in some people changing what? So we're looking for where they're most skeptical, so that's going to be the highest value for no, right? So no is given by my darkest block, so I look for my largest no section. I see I have that here, and that would be changes in driving style. So that'll be my answer when I go down to question 21, and that'll be D. All right, now we can go ahead and move on to passage 3. We've got questions 22 to 32. This passage is adapted from Sabrina Richards' Pleasant to the Touch. In the early 1990s, textbooks acknowledged that humans had slow conducting nerves, but asserted that those nerves only responded to two types of stimuli, pain and temperature. Sensations of pressure and vibration were believed to travel only along myelinated, fast-signaling nerve fibers, which also give information about location. Experiments blocking nerve fibers supported this notion. Preventing fast fibers from firing, either by clamping the relevant nerve or by injecting the local anesthetic lidocaine, seemed to eliminate the sensations of pressure altogether, but blocking slow fibers only seemed to reduce sensitivity to warmth or a small painful shock. Hakan Olasan and his Gothenburg University colleagues Ake Valbo and Johan Westberg wondered if slow fibers responsive to gentle pressure might be active in humans as well as in other mammals. In 1993, they corralled 28 young volunteers and recorded nerve signals while gently brushing the subject's arms with their fingertips, using a technique called microneurography, in which a fine filament is inserted into a single nerve to capture its electrical impulses. Scientists were able to measure how quickly or slowly the nerves fired. They showed that soft strokings prompted two different signals, one immediate and one delayed. The delay, Olason explains, means that the signal from a gentle touch on the forearm will reach the brain about half a second later. This delay identified nerve impulses traveling at speeds characteristic of slow, unmyelinated fibers, about 1 meter per second, confirming the presence of these fibers in human hairy skin. In contrast, fast-conducting fibers, already known to respond to the touch, signal at a rate between 35 and 75 meters per second. Then in 1999, so we have a second experiment, the group looked more closely at the characteristics of the slow fibers. They named these low-threshold nerves C-tactile or CT fibers, said Alazan, because of their exquisite sensitivity to slow, gentle tactile stimulation, but unresponsiveness to noxious stimuli like pinpricks. But why exactly humans might have such fibers, which responded to only a narrow range of rather subtle stimuli, was initially mystifying. Unlike other types of sensory nerves, CT fibers could be found only in hairy human skin, such as the forearm and thigh. No amount of gentle stroking of hairless skin, such as the palms and soles of the feet, prompted similar activity signatures. Oluwasan and his colleagues decided that these fibers must be conveying a different dimension of sensory information than a fast-conducing fibers. Although microneurography can give information about how a single nerve responds to gentle brushing and pressure, it cannot tease out what aspect of sensation that fiber relays, says Alazan. He wanted to know if that same slow nerve can distinguish where the brush touches the arm and whether it can discern the difference between a goat hair brush and a feather. Most importantly, right, so this is important, could that same fiber convey a pleasant sensation? To address this question, Alazan's group sought out a patient known as GL who had an unusual nerve defect. More than 2 decades earlier, she had developed numbness across many parts of her body after taking penicillin to treat a cough and fever. Testing showed that she had lost responsiveness to pressure, and a nerve biopsy confirmed that GL's quick-conducting fibers were gone, resulting in an inability to sense any pokes, prods, or pinpricks below her nose. But she could still sense warmth, suggesting that her slow-conducting, unmyelinated fibers were intact. Upon recruiting GL, Oluwazan tested her by brushing her arm gently at a speed between 2 to 10 centimeters per second. She had more trouble distinguishing the direction or pressure of the brush strokes than most subjects, but she reported feeling a pleasant sensation. When the researchers tried brushing her palm, where CT fibers are not found, she felt nothing. Oluwazan used functional MRI studies to examine which areas of the brain lit up when GL's arm was gently brushed to activate CT fibers. In normal subjects, both the somatosensory and insular cortices were activated, but only the insular cortex, which processes emotion, was active when researchers brushed GL's arm. This solidified the notion that CT fibers convey a more emotional quality of touch, rather than the conscious aspect that helps us describe what we are sensing. CT fibers, it seems, specifically provide pleasurable sensations. All right, based on the passage, textbook authors in the early 1990s would most likely have expected which condition to result from blocking fast fibers. All right, well, if we go back up, right, and we need evidence anyways, so while we're up there, we're going to look for our evidence. So we're asked about what would have been expected to result from blocking fast fibers. All right, so we know that's going to be in the beginning. Well, it tells us sensations of pressure and vibration, right here, where this parenthesis starts, Sensations of pressure and vibration were believed to travel only along myelinated fast signaling nerve fibers, which also give information about location. All right, so that's basically telling us, hey, pressure and vibration were believed that they could only travel along fast signaling nerve fibers. So if those were blocked off, we wouldn't be able to sense pressure and vibration. All right, so that's also going to note that that's going to be from lines 4 to about 7, right? So lines 4 to 7 is going to be our evidence there. Lines 4 to 7, we can go and click on that. And then we've got, for our answer in 22, the rate at which other nerve fibers would increase. No, the test subject would perceive gentle stimuli as painful. No, the body would compensate by using slow fibers to sense pressure. No, the ability to perceive vibrations would be impaired, right? They wouldn't be able to perceive them because our fast fibers would be blocked. All right, question 24. As used in line 18, active most nearly means. So we find 18. 18 says, we're going to read the whole sentence, obviously, but we've got active right here. So we see what that means. We have Hakan Alwazan and his Gothenburg University colleagues Ake Valbo and Johann Westberg wondered if slow fibers response to gentle pressure might be active in humans as well as in other mammals, right? So whether that might be active in humans as well as other mammals, right? Whether that's present in humans or other mammals, right? That response, right? Whether that response is active, whether that response is present, right? If that response is there. Not if the response is attentive, not if it's movable, and not if it's restless. If it's present, right? If it's active in mammals and humans. All right, as used in line 24, capture most nearly means. Line 24, I look at my options here. We got capture is right here. So I'm going to go ahead and read that sentence. Using a technique called microneurography, in which a fine filament is inserted into a single nerve to capture its electrical impulses. Well, this is going to mean record, right? We have a fine filament is inserted in a single nerve to record or measure its electrical impulses, right? So we're looking for record there. So we're going to go down, see what our options are. We see we have record, C, and that's why I always recommend coming up with your answer for what it most nearly means before looking at your answer choices, because then you're not going to be swayed or caught between two because you have your own from the text, and that's really going to help you out so you don't get stuck between two or swayed by one of the first answer choices you read. All right, question 26. Which conclusion is best supported by the findings of Olawazan's 1993 experiment? Okay, keep in mind this is the 1993 one and not the 1999. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at our options here. We have stimulation at bodily extremities can be sensed as rapidly as stimulation closer to the brain. No, we weren't talking about distance to the brain or farther from the brain. B, the presence of hairs in human skin lessens the speed with which nerves conduct signals. No, it doesn't have to do with the presence of human hairs in the skin, right? What it has to do is with the fact of the kind of, here I'll go find it, the kind of nerves, right, that are in that, the type of skin with hairs versus without. It has to do with those nerves, right? Whether they're fast or whether they're slow. And then C, gentle pressure is sensed not only by fast fibers, but also by slow fibers. Or D, the speed at which a nerve fires is dependent on the strength of pressure applied. We never discuss strength of pressure, right? But we do talk about how gentle pressure is sensed not only by fast fibers, but also by slow fibers, right? And that's discussed above. I'm guessing we have to provide evidence for that. Yes, we do. So we're going to go find where it discusses gentle pressure being sensed by fast and slow fibers. We're going to look in the range between 22 and 30 primarily, because that's where our first three are. So we're going to go look at that. 22 to 30, we're going to look at that range, find where our evidence is. So we've got 22s here. Using a technique called microneurography, in which a fine filament is inserted into a single nerve to capture its electrical impulses, the scientists were able to measure how quickly or slowly the nerves fired. They showed that soft stroking prompted two different signals, one immediate and one delayed, right? So that's going to be evidence of one from the fast nerve signals, right, and one from the slow. So that's going to be our evidence there. We see that that's from 26 to 28. So that's where our evidence for that one's going to be. So that'll be answer choice B for 27. All right, now we can go ahead and move on to our next question. All right, our next question is going to be 28. The sentences in line 43 to 45, but to mystifying, serves mainly to do what? All right, let's go ahead and find our sentences. But mystifying serves mainly to do what? All right, well, we start here. We've got, but why exactly humans might have such fibers which respond only to a narrow range of rather subtle stimuli was initially mystifying, right? So they weren't quite sure why we would have these fibers, right, that are slow and only respond to a very small range of subtle stimuli, so not really anything crazy important at first glance, right? So now we're told in our question, what does it serve mainly to do? Well, it's not identifying factors that he had previously failed to consider. Is it proposing a solution to a dilemma encountered by Olazan? No, that doesn't propose a solution at all. It's more asking an intriguing question of why. Why is this like this, right? And then C, anticipated potential criticism. No, but what we are doing is we are showing a problem from the perspective of his team, right? The problem is they don't know why it would be there, right? Why would we need these if it's only giving us a narrow range, right? It's only giving us response to a narrow range of small stimuli. Then why would we need it, right? So that's the problem that they are facing in their perspective, right? So that's D. Question 29. It can be reasonably be inferred that one of the intended goals of the 1999 experiment was to determine what? Well, that's going to be the precise nature of sensations that CT fibers can convey. Or is it B, relationship between body hair and CT fiber function? No. Role played by CT fibers in the perception of pain? No. And then D, effect of microneurography on CT fiber signaling? No. If we go back up and we look at our, I believe we started as we read through it, right? It said most importantly, could that same fiber convey a pleasant sensation? That's what we were concerned with most importantly in that 1999 experiment, and that correlates with our answer choice A, determining the precise nature of the sensations CT fibers can convey. And then we have question 30, the main purpose of the sixth paragraph, lines 64 to 75 is to what? Well, we're going to go find it, quickly brush over it. See, we start here. To address the question, they sought out a patient known as GL, and then we describe everything that makes GL the perfect patient for this experiment, right? So that's going to go down. We see we've got identify those of GL's neurological conditions that might be relieved by the experiment. No, it doesn't say anything about her conditions being relieved. B, contextualize the nerve function of GL by comparing it with other adults. No. C, detail procedures that GL had experienced during previous experiments. No. D, indicate why GL's medical condition was of value to the experiment, right? Why she was the perfect candidate for this experiment. According to the passage, GL differed from Olazan's other test subjects in terms of the what? A, number of cortices activated in the brain during gentle brushing. B, physical dimensions of the somatosensory cortex. We never talk about dimensions. C, intensity of nerve signals required to activate the insular context. No, we don't talk about the intensity of nerve signals. D, the effect of MRI scanning on the basic functions of brain cortex. No. If we remember back, right, we had the number of cortices activated in the brain during gentle brushing. It was about 3 for other people, and it was only 1 for GL, right? And I'm going to see, okay, we don't have to provide evidence, but I'm going to do it anyways just to show you. Right, we go ahead and we look at it. We've got brushing occurs here, right? And then we talk about the functional MRI studies in which areas of the brain lit up when GL's arm was gently brushed. We've got in normal subject, there was the somatosensory and the insular cortexes were activated, but only the insular cortex was active when they brushed GL's arm, right? So that's a different number of cortices activated. Question 32, according to the passage, humans experience an emotional aspect of touch when what? Well, that's going to be when CT fibers are exposed to a stimulus, right? That's what we talked about. That was the main goal to drive home in this passage. Not A, brain cortices are shielded from nerve signals. C, nerve fibers that sense pain are suppressed. No. And conscious aspects of sensation are ignored. No. It was all about CT fibers being exposed to stimulus. At least the back end was, right? So that's going to be our answer for 32. Now we can go ahead and move on to passage 4. Passage 1 is adopted from a speech delivered in 1898 by Albert J. Beveridge, March of the Flag. Passage 2 is adapted from a speech delivered in 1900 by William Jennings Bryan titled Imperialism. So we'll go ahead and read passage 1. Fellow citizens, it is a noble land that God has given us, a land that can feed and clothe the world, a land whose coastlines would enclose half the countries of Europe, a land set like a sentinel between the 2 imperial oceans of the globe, a greater England with a nobler destiny. It is a mighty people that he has planted on this soil, a people sprung from the most masterful blood of history, a people perpetually revitalized by the virile working folk of all the earth, a people imperial by virtue of their power, by right of their institutions, by authority of their heaven-directed purposes, the propagandists and not the misers of liberty. It is a glorious history our God has bestowed upon his chosen people, a history whose keynote was struck by Liberty Bell, a history heroic with faith in our mission and our future, a history of statesmen who flung the boundaries of the Republic out into the unexplored lands, a history of soldiers who carried the flag across blazing deserts and through the ranks of hostile mountains, even to the gates of sunset, a history of a multiplying people who overran a continent in half a century, a history divinely logical in the process of whose tremendous reasoning we find ourselves today. Think of the thousands of Americans who will pour into Hawaii and Puerto Rico when the Republic's laws cover those lands with justice and safety. Think of the tens of thousands of Americans who will invade the Philippines when a liberal government shall establish order and equity there. Think of the hundreds of thousands of Americans who will build a civilization of energy and industry in Cuba when a government of law replaces a double reign of anarchy and tyranny. Think of the prosperous millions that Empress of Islands will support when, obedient to the law of political gravitation, her people ask for the highest honor liberty can bestow, the sacred order of the stars and stripes, the citizenship of the great republic. All right, so that's passage 1, so I'm going to go ahead and answer the questions regarding that. In passage 1, Beveridge asserts that the resources and immensity of the United States constitute not a safeguard against foreign invasion. A replication of conditions in Europe? No, even though we say the word Europe, we're not talking about how it's a replication of the conditions of Europe. Divine gifts to the American people? Yes, right? We're talking about how all the land, the resources, right? They're a divine gift from God to the American people, and it's not a source of envy in other countries. Question 34, in the second paragraph, passage 1, lines 26 to 41, the commands given by Beveridge mainly serve to do what? Well, let's go quickly take a look at it. We've got 26 to 41. Well, if we look at all these commands, right, they're all about the positive things that would come from the policy of going to foreign countries like Hawaii, or not necessarily foreign countries, but Hawaii, right, Puerto Rico, these islands, right, Cuba, these islands, and instituting American policies, right, having America go there, kind of take over a little bit. So we've got, in the second paragraph of passage 1, the commands mainly serve to what? Remind the audience of its civic responsibilities? No, because that would imply that it's domestic. B, anticipate the benefits of a proposed policy? Yes, we're anticipating all the good things that would happen if we were to go to those countries, right, and then put in place American laws, and then all these Americans would be allowed to visit there, right? It'd be all these great things in the eyes of the author of passage 1. So our answer there is going to be B. Question 35, as used in line 72, recalled most nearly means what? All right, well, now we're on passage 2, so we're going to go ahead and read that. If it is right for the United States to hold the Philippine Islands permanently and imitate the European empires and the government of colonies, the Republican Party ought to state its position and defend it, but it must expect the subject races to protest against such a policy and to resist to the extent of their ability. The Filipinos do not need any encouragement from Americans now living. Our whole history has been an encouragement not only to the Filipinos, but to all who are denied a voice in their own government. If the Republicans are prepared to censor all who have used language calculated to make the Filipinos hate foreign domination, let them condemn the speech of Patrick Henry when he uttered that passionate appeal, "Give me liberty or give me death." He expressed a sentiment which still echoes in the hearts of men. Let them censor Jefferson. Of all the statesmen of history, none have used words so offensive to those who would hold their fellows in political bondage. Let them censor Washington, who declared that the colonists must choose between liberty and slavery. Or, if the statute of limitations has run against the sins of Henry and Jefferson and Washington, let them censor Lincoln, whose Gettysburg speech will be quoted in defense of popular government when the present advocates of force and conquest are forgotten. Someone has said that a truth once spoken can never be recalled. It goes on, and no one can set a limit to its ever-widening influence. But if it were possible to obliterate every word written or spoken in defense of the principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence, a war of conquest would still leave its legacy of perpetual hatred, for it was God himself who placed in every human heart the love of liberty. He never made a race of people so low in the scale of civilization or intelligence that it would welcome a foreign master. Those who would have this nation enter upon a career of empire must consider not only the effect of imperialism on the Filipinos, but they must also calculate its effects on our own nation. We cannot repudiate the principle of self-government in the Philippines without weakening that principle here. All right, well, I see I've got question 35, as used in line 72, recalled most nearly means. I go ahead and find line 72, recalled right here. Someone has said that a truth once spoken can never be recalled, right? Well, that would mean a truth once spoken can never be taken back, right? It would mean a truth once spoken can never be taken back, essentially. So we find a word that means that. It can never be not rejected, not repeated, but it can never be retracted, right? A truth once spoken, right? It's true. It can't ever be retracted, right? It will be remembered, but A and C are wrong. Answer's going to be B. It can never be retracted. All right. Now we've got question 36. It can reasonably be inferred from passage 2 that Brian considers the preference for a national sovereignty over foreign rule to be what? Well, a reaction to the excess of imperial governments in the modern era. Well, we don't really talk about the modern era and the excess of imperial governments. A sign that belief in human equality is widespread. We don't touch on human equality, right? C, a testament to the effects of the foreign policy of the United States. No, that's not really at all what it means, right? His whole point behind the preference for national sovereignty over foreign rule, well, that's going to be that it's a manifestation of an innate drive in humans towards self-rule, right? He talks about how if the United States was to take action in the policies described in passage 1, essentially, how there would be conflict, right? How people naturally, like they're designed by God to have an innate drive towards self-rule. All right, which choice provides the best evidence to the previous question? Well, what I'm looking at right off the bat is when we said in 79, he never made a race of people so low in civilization or intelligent that it would welcome a foreign master. I go ahead and look and see if that is on there, and it is. That's 79 to 81. So that's going to be my answer there. That's going to be C for question 37. I move on to 38. As used in line 85, calculate most nearly means. Find 85. We've got those who would have this nation enter upon a career of empire must consider not only the effect of imperialism on the Filipinos, but they must also calculate its effects upon our own nation. So I would say, but they must also weigh its effects on our own nation, or evaluate its effects on our own nation. So I'm going to see if I have either of those. I see I have A, evaluate, so that'll be my answer there. Question 39. In developing their respective arguments, Beveridge, passage 1, and Bryan, passage 2, both express admiration for what? Well, they both express admiration for the founding and history of the United States. Right? They don't express admiration for the vibrancy and diversity of American culture, or the worldwide struggle, or the worldwide history of struggles for independence, or the idealism that permeates many aspects of American society. And I'll show you how I know that this is correct as A. All throughout passage 2, right, he talks about the Declaration of Independence and all these great American figures who all supported American independence, right, and the right of one country to rule themselves. And then in passage 1, we've got him talking about how we have this great land that was given to us by God, right? How America was a great country, how it's a mighty people that God's put on the soil, right? So we're all talking about how the founding and history of the United States, right? And how there's admiration in both passages. So our answer there is A. Question 40. Which choice best describes the central difference between how passage 1, Beveridge, and Bryan in passage 2 view the concept of liberty as it's realized in the United States? We've got A. Beveridge presents it as a direct inheritance of European colonization, whereas Bryan presents it as a sharp break from earlier governments in Europe. No, that's not at all what we're talking about, or at least not very close. And then B. Beveridge considers it so exemplary as to justify the conquest of other regions, right? He does. He's advocating for us taking over Puerto Rico and Cuba, whereas Bryan warns its exemplary quality would be undermined by imperial expansion. All right, so here's what I know about that. I know that that's going to be my answer because in Beveridge's whole passage 1, he's talking about how America is so great that we have to spread this liberty, right? We have to spread this concept of liberty to these other nations, right? And then it'll make it so great. Whereas Bryan is saying this concept of liberty, right, this exemplary quality, would be undermined in America if we did this because we're not giving other countries their liberty. So our answer there is B. All right, question 41. It can be most reasonably inferred from passage 2 that Bryan would criticize the vision of American governance of island territories that Beveridge presents in passage 1 for being what? Well, it's not going to be A, right, because it says unrealistic, since most Americans would be unwilling to relocate to distant islands, but we never talk about Americans being unwilling to relocate to distant islands. We know A is going to be incorrect. We look at B, deceptive, since economic domination will be the true goal of the American government. Well, Bryan never actually argues that economic domination would be the true goal of the American government, so we can get rid of B. C, impractical, since the islanders would insist upon an equal distribution of resources. Once again, Bryan doesn't talk about that the islanders would insist on an equal distribution of resources. We can get out C. And D, naive, since the islanders would object to being governed by Americans. And that'll be our answer, because if we go, and we're going to need to find evidence for that anyways. So if we go, we see we're looking from 52 to 59 for our evidence. So we go, or from 42 to 59. So we'll go find where 42 is at. All right, so in the beginning until the end of the second paragraph, we have, if it's right for the United States to hold the Philippine Islands permanently and imitate European empires in the government of colonies, the Republican Party ought to state its position, but it must expect the subject races to protest against such a policy and resist to the extent of their ability. Right, so we're looking from about 46 then to about 48, because that's explaining, right, 46 to 48, because that's explaining why they won't be able to to do it, right? Why it's naive to think that they'll be able to just step in and automatically take over, right? So that's showing why the islanders would object to being governed by Americans, right? So that idea that they could just come in there is naive. So our answer there will be A. Okay, we can go ahead and move on to questions 43 to the end, which will be 52. So 43 to 52 are based on the following. This passage is adapted from Peter A. Ensminger, Life Under the Sun, 2001, by Peter A. Ensminger. So I'll go ahead and read this. If you've already read it, you can go ahead and skip in to when I start getting into the answers and the answer explanations, but for now I'm going to go ahead and get started reading it. Many millennia before the invention of herbicides, farmers simply plowed their fields to control weeds. Even today, plowing can constitute a valuable part of an integrated weed management program. Although plowing kills standing weeds, farmers have long known that it often leads to the emergence of new weed seedlings in a few weeks. Ecologists have shown that a farmer's field can have 50,000 or more weeds per square meter buried beneath the soil surface. Plant physiologists have shown that seeds buried more than about 1 centimeter below the soil surface do not receive enough light to germinate. Do the blades of a plow, which can reach more than a foot beneath the soil of the surface, bring some of these buried seeds to the surface where their germination is induced by exposure to sunlight? All right, so that's what our question is. Two ecologists, Jonathan Sower and Gwendolyn Struik, began to study this question in the 1960s. In a relatively simple experiment, they went to 10 different habitats in Wisconsin during the night and collected pairs of soil samples. They stirred up the soil in one sample of each in the light and stirred up the other sample of each pair in the dark. They then exposed all 10 pairs to natural sunlight in a greenhouse. For 9 of the 10 pairs of soil samples, weed growth was greater in the samples stirred up in light. They concluded that soil disturbance gives weed seeds a light break, and this stimulates their germination. More recently, Carl Hartmann of Erlangen University in Germany reasoned that when farmers plowed their fields during the day, the buried weed seeds are briefly exposed to sunlight as the soil is turned over, and that this stimulates their germination. Although the light exposures from plowing may be less than 1 millisecond, that can be enough to induce seed germination. Thus, the germination of weed seeds would be minimized if farmers simply plowed their fields during the night. When the photon fluence rate, the rate at which photons hit the surface, is below 10 to the power 15 photons per square meter per second. Although even under these conditions, hundreds of millions of photons strike each square millimeter of ground each second. This illumination is below the threshold needed to stimulate the germination of most seeds. Hartmann says that he was very skeptical when he first came up with this idea because he assumed that such a simple method of weed control as plowing at nighttime must be ineffective or it would have been discovered long ago. But the subsequent experiments, first presented at a 1989 scientific meeting in Freiburg, Germany, clearly demonstrated that the method can be effective. Hartmann tested his idea by plowing 2 agricultural strips near Alterschassen, Germany. The farmer Karl Seidel cultivated one strip repeated threefold at around midday and the other strip at night. No crops were planted in these pilot experiments to avoid possible competition with the emerging weeds. The results were dramatic. More than 80% of the surface of the field plowed in daylight was covered by weeds, whereas only 2% of the field plowed at night was covered by weeds. This method of weed control is currently being used by several farmers in Germany. Because many of the same weed species that invade farmers' fields in Germany also invade fields elsewhere in the world, this method should be successful elsewhere. In fact, recent studies at universities in Nebraska, Oregon, Denmark, Sweden, Minnesota, and Argentina support this idea. All right, now we can go ahead and get into our questions. So we've got question 43 as our first question. I see we have a data table, so I'll probably have a question at the end on that. All right, so according to the passage, exposure to light allows seeds to do what? Begin to develop, right? Germinate, which means the seeds will begin to develop, not absorb necessary nutrients, not withstand extreme temperatures, not achieve maximum growth. All right, question 44. The question in the second paragraph, lines 13 to 17, primarily serves to what? Well, we can go back and look at it just so we, just as a, form the habit of using the text to make sure you're right. So we've got, do the blades of a plow, which can reach more than a foot beneath the soil, bring some of these buried seeds to the surface where their germination is induced by exposure to sunlight? Well, that's introducing our experiment, right? It's testing that question is what our experiment does. So that will be, we'll look at our answer choices. A, emphasize the provisional nature of the findings discussed in the passage. No. B, introduce the specific research topic addressed in the passage. C, suggest the hypothetical impact of the studies analyzed. Right, we're not discussing the hypothetical impact, right? We're discussing what happened in the study. And then D, indicate the level of disagreement about the methods. No, there isn't really a level of disagreement. What we're talking about right? We're introducing that specific research topic of will those seeds germinate when they're exposed to light during the day, and should we plow at night instead, addressed in the passage. So our answer there is B. Now we got question 45. As used in line 16, induced most nearly means. We go up to line 16, find induced. We'll circle it, and now we'll read that sentence. Do the blades of a plow, which can reach more than a foot below the surface of the soil, bring some of these buried seeds to the surface where their germination is induced by exposure to sunlight? Well, here induced could mean stimulated, right? Their germination is stimulated by exposure to sunlight, caused by exposure to sunlight. So we'll go down, we'll look at our answer choices. It's not going to be lured, not going to be established, not going to be convinced. D, stimulated, right? Their germination is stimulated by exposure to sunlight. 46, which choice best supports the idea that seeds present in fields plowed at night are exposed to some amount of light, right? Well, if we go back up, we see, I remember where it was right here, right? Top of this second column here, it says, go ahead and read the first part of that sentence. Although even under these conditions being when farmers plowed their fields during the night, right? I'm circling it right here. During the night, even during the night, under these conditions, hundreds of millions of photons strike each square milliliter of ground each second, right? So I'm looking for my answer being, for evidence, being about 44 to about 47 here, right? 44 to about 47, 43, 47 if we're counting this part, right? So I'll go find that. 43 to 47 is going to be my answer. That'll be C. 47. The passage suggests that if Seidel had planted wheat or corn on the 2 agricultural strips in Hartman's experiment, the percentage of the surface of each strip covered with weeds would likely have been lower than the percentage that Hartman found. Well, yes, right? The percentage of the surface of each strip covered with weeds would have been lower than the percentage Hartman found, and I'll go show you why, and I have to anyways because the next question is evidence, so I'll find that while I show you. So lower than the percentage Hartman found if he was planting crops there, because it says that there's competition between the weeds and the crops. So I'm going to find where it says that right here. No crops were planted in these pilot experiments to avoid possible competition with the emerging weeds, right? So if these weeds had to compete with the crops that were planted, the weeds would not have grown, right? There wouldn't have been as much weeds. There still might have been some, but there would have been less. Right? And I forgot, I got to get my line numbers to show you guys the evidence there. So that's going to be from 60 to 62, right? So that's going to be my evidence for that. So go down, and that is going to be answer choice B. All right, question 49. As used in line 62, dramatic most nearly means. I'm going to go find line 62, circle the word dramatic. Okay, what does it most nearly mean? Well, I read it, the results were dramatic. More than 80% of the surface of the field plowed in daylight was covered by weeds, but only 2% of the field plowed at night was covered by weeds. All right, so just coming up with possible answer choices for dramatic here. The results were staggering, anything along those lines, right? But yeah, we're not looking at like drama as in acting. We're looking at it was dramatic as in it was staggering, right? So theatrical is going to be out. The results were emotional. No, the results were not emotional. Were the results sudden? We're not giving a time frame, right? It's not like things grew in 5 seconds, right? I'm sure the weeds took time to grow, but the results were impressive, right? That was a big difference, that 80% versus 2%, right? All right, and then 50, according to the table, in which soil sample disturbed in darkness, so the soil sample disturbed in darkness, did the fewest number of seedlings emerge? I'm going to go find my table. I'm only considering my column that is disturbed in darkness, which is my right side column. And I'm asked for the one in which the fewest seedlings emerge, and that's going to be in sample A right there. So that'll be my answer there, sample A, and I see that sample A is choice A. So my answer for 50 will be A. I can go and move to 51. As presented in the table, which sample produced the most seedlings when the soil was disturbed in light? So my column is going to be now this left side, this light, and I'm asked for the one which had the most seeds emerge, which is sample I with 14. So my answer there will be sample I, which is C. Question 52. The data presented in the table most directly supports which claim from the passage? All right, so I've got the data presented in the table most directly supports which claim from the passage? All right, I'm going to go to lines 1, 3, 8, 10, 10, 13, and then 38, 43. So I'm going to look at the data real quick to get a synopsis of what's going on. All right, what I see is that I see the seedlings that are emerging in darkness is far less than those that emerged in light, right? So that's where I'm looking for my claim on that. Well, where my claim I don't believe it is right off the bat is going to be lines 1 to 3 and 8 to 10, because we don't, and 10 to 13 really, because we don't really get into a claim that early. Like, all of that is really just introducing what our claim is. So I'm actually going to quick check and see if it's a D. So that's going to be 38 to 43, because I don't remember us talking about any claim along those lines here. So I'm going to go to lines 38 to 43 to start. So 38 to 43. All right, I see, thus the germination of weed seeds would be minimized if farmers simply plowed their fields during the night when the photon fluence rate is below 10 to the power 15 photons per square meter per second. Yes, that's what our data supported, right? It's supporting how the germination of these weed seeds is less when it's plowed during the night, which is what our data showed. So that's going to be my answer there, and that was answer choice D. Thank you for watching Preeminent Test Prep. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share, as we will be releasing more videos to help you prepare for the SAT.